Anytime I play something that has a sort of emphasis on realism, there is a question that subconsciously lingers in the back of my mind. How true to life is this actually? The personal importance of that question to me has a lot to do with my own imagination. I like to imagine how well I would fare if instead of controlling a Formula race car with a controller, I was strapped in and driving under pressure, or understanding how I could even attempt to do this many backflips on a snowboard. And as I daydream about whether or not I have what it takes to be an F1 racer, or an extreme snowboarder, I become momentarily interested in the nature of the trade itself. What would it take to perform in these adrenaline-filled sports, and what are the parallels between reality and virtual reality? I suppose my interest behind these wonders arise from my urge to constantly make up my own sentiments regarding them, and whether they'd stack up to my expectations that I've gotten from playing something that is a simulation, or emulation, purposely designed to be rewarding. And needless to say, this is just the case for me regarding war-themed shooters. Going back through my library and recalling the games I've primarily been playing over the last few years, I noted that even with the hundreds of hours I've spent playing games like Battlefield, Insurgency, Squad, or even Arma 3, and surviving hundreds of thousands of tense encounters in their multiplayer modes, is that no game has gotten me anywhere close to pondering the emotional burden derived from the stressfulness of those real-life situations, except for one multiplayer shooter that most people haven't even heard of.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
Darkest Hour 44-45 is a mod by Darklight Games for the original Red Orchestra. Focusing on the Western Front of World War II, it depicts various battles fought by Commonwealth and American forces in team-versus-team multiplayer matches that are of similar scale to DICE's Battlefield series. With the same huge emphasis on the realistic ballistics and lethality of Red Orchestra, Darkest Hour was unique among the World War II shooter market of the early to mid-2000s. But mostly lived in the shadows of games like Day of Defeat Source and the earlier Call of Duties that sported huge PC communities at the time. Although, even to this day, there is a small yet very committed community that still enjoy official content updates from its developer. Now, at first glance, you're probably thinking, seriously? This is the game that was the catalyst for this video? If the footage was switched out with a 6th generation Call of Duty or Medal of Honor, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you hadn't played it before. Well, before you judge it for its lack of ray tracing, real-time shadows, or any modern graphic features for that matter, just know that I haven't been able to find a more immersive shooter that has reminded me of how inequitable war can be. If I had to describe this game in a sentence, Darkest Hour is as relentless as it is unfair. Which I find to be interesting the more I put Darkest Hour's gameplay under a microscope. You see, the gameplay isn't anywhere as complicated in terms of controls or minute mechanics as military simulations or other realism shooters that dominate the Steam charts. At a glance, this game doesn't seem very hard to grasp. The fundamental inputs are familiar if you spend any time playing military-themed shooters. Engagements typically only take place at mid to close range, and there is no need for unilateral coordinated team maneuvers across vast maps. In fact, any emphasis on coordination is very much dialed down for the most part. Everything feels familiar in the context of a multiplayer shooter. And I suppose this is what makes Darkest Hour's first impression usually so sharp on newcomers. In a matter of minutes, you come to find that despite the familiar setup, your experiences playing other games has taught you jack shit. All the fundamentals of traditional modern shooters, like twitchy reflexes, playful recoil management, and forgiving exposure to sightlines, are not only completely absent, they have left you worse off for a warzone where your vulnerability as a person is woven into all the mechanics that typically enable you to kill in other shooters. And while a lot of this is true of newcomers' experiences with other realism shooters, there is no other that beats you down as hard as Darkest Hour. Your first hours playing this game are testing, as they involve you dying repeatedly and often without warning. Getting anywhere close to the action will result in your character collapsing from gunshot wounds or helplessly being ragdolled into the air by a screaming artillery shell, only for this to happen again and again and again in other variously unexpected ways. Those what the fuck moments that occur when you die in a clustered match of Operation Metro or Shipment exemplifies the nature of Darkest Hour's learning curve. Newcomers are cannon fodder, and even skillful players inevitably return to the meat grinder. Retuning your instincts to just be able to navigate one of Darkest Hour's various push maps, let alone even being fortunate enough to spend more time playing than in the respawn screen, is a matter of vividly studying from your mistakes over and over again. And even when you've picked up the ropes, you are constantly reminded that as long as something could go wrong, it will go wrong, as has been true in literally every match of this game that I've played. Never have I picked up a game where Murphy's Law was so prevalent, and this is perhaps why Darkest Hour conjures up so many anti-war interpretations when I play it. It's not just that walking into any given situation can shun you into immediate death, it's the knowledge that you could have done an infinite amount of things differently before you died that in the best case scenario would have just prolonged your character's untimely demise by only a short amount of time. In a situation where there are so many ongoing factors that determine life or death, having been able to anticipate the exact moment when you were about to die seems insignificant, as even if you were to overcome, you likely would have ended up in just as bad of a position for the next set of treacherous and uncontrollable circumstances you go up against. It's this form of hindsight that makes more of a lasting imprint on every life and death I have in Darkest Hour. While there is certainly a lot of parallels to draw with how your character lives and dies in a way that feels insignificant in the space of a larger battle to other games, the realistic setting, density of the map designs, player vulnerability, and minimalist UI information draws on a sense of hopelessness that gives more significance to the nature of being a cog in the machine. Getting over the brutal learning curve only just emphasizes this interpretation, by giving you an understanding of just how much conditioning it takes to survive a few minutes longer in Darkest Hour's barbaric firefights, especially since there is really only one way to impact your team's success, by involving yourself in the chaos of those situations. For me personally, this has grown a subconscious realization that has made me aware that you have to be okay with the possibility of being on the receiving end and possibly dying in order to function in situations like this. It's kind of like what Spear says.
The only hope you have is to accept the fact that you're already dead.
And unlike these games, you can't lean on teammates or strategies of squad leaders and platoon commanders. Unless you are proficient in one of the very limited support roles, there is not much in the way a typical player can do to avoid this reality. It's woken me up to the realization that although someone more skillful will likely last longer, the dynamic nature of a battlefield is too unpredictable for anyone to be safe. As long as they keep on fighting, their time will come. And it's just that, a matter of time, and some are more lucky than others. The time I've spent dying in Darkest Hour has given me a deeper meaning to the reality of you being unable to cheat death in war, because the only way for you to cheat death in Darkest Hour is by not being a participant. But since playing Darkest Hour requires you to be a participant, enjoying it is to enjoy a sense of disparity that arises from engaging in its tense encounters. This disparity is Darkest Hour's heart and soul, and it's why I have so much love for it. It dresses up the otherwise straightforward combat to feel more like an entanglement of personal gambles, resulting in each death being far more interesting. However, before I can explain the significance of these parallels and their broader implications, insight is required on some of the aspects that distinguish Darkest Hour's combat. I've played a whole host of hardcore tactical shooters. In fact, I'd say they're my preferred genre at this point. All the ones I've come to favor are authentically grotesque, usually with gameplay that is punishing to match. And while Day of Infamy, Arma, and even Red Orchestra's sequels do their own thing to reframe combat with intense decision making and gunplay, I'm not aware of a multiplayer shooter that is enriched by character fatigue and clumsiness in the same manner as Darkest Hour. For starters, movement windup is appropriately slow. In fact, it's very different to most of the games I just mentioned. It can take a few moments for your character to reach max speed, and turning quickly or strafing will slow you down. This means repositioning needs to be somewhat premeditated, as a lot of momentum has to be taken into account. Additionally, running into any piece of geometry will awkwardly cause you to stop and lose your footing, as will it affect you and another player if you bump into each other, costing you both if you're in an enemy sightline. Dog Green, a push map that depicts the famous D-Day landing, emphasizes caution in both of these regards. As in the beginning moments when you touch down on the beach in a U-boat crowded with friendly players, chaos can easily arise. If the people in front cannot quickly move out of the way for the guy behind them the second the ramp goes down, a pileup will undoubtedly ensue, along with a total reenactment of the first 5 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. And that probably sounds frustrating as all hell, but it accomplishes a lot by giving a sense of claustrophobia and lack of control that is really hard to reenact with buttery smooth movement, especially in a multiplayer shooter. The clunkiness of this movement system lends itself to other areas as well, making close-quarter encounters surprisingly intimate at times, as unsuspecting players often fumble against each other, ill-prepared for either melee or ranged combat. This, diced up with agonizingly slow reload animations and uncentered hip firing, makes 2 players trapped in a room play out as a kind of frantic rock, paper, scissors. Sometimes you wish you could just use your helmet at a press of a button to give you the seconds you need to pull back a bolt or equip a bayonet. These situations never fail to give me a sense of tension similar to another scene from Saving Private Ryan, where 2 soldiers sluggishly fight in a room, going back and forth. Encounters like this spark rare moments of online cowardice, where sometimes the person you're fighting against will simply run out of the room just to breathe. It's nowhere close to being smooth, but unless you were a trained samurai or a Jedi or something, I don't see any part of this situation that could possibly be viewed as smooth in reality. The jank or awkwardness of the movement input and toe-to-toe distance required for melees to actually land gives these encounters a kind of panic-stricken adrenaline rush, far more than shooters that have smooth and easy to master melee combat, where a similar situation like this would hardly play out more than 2 different ways in half the duration. In any other game, fleeing like this just feels like strategically retreating, but in the context of a situation that's becoming increasingly more and more desperate, it invokes an incredible feeling of self-worth, especially if you can persevere. Despair is often invoked in the way range encounters play it as well. Finding an angle to fire back accurately can feel pretty futile if you're up against players who know how to lock down a flank. Mind you that a single round can kill you instantly and suppression can be deafening, so taking the time to find an appropriate stance or surface to accommodate the plentiful weapon sway and recoil, all while suppression and ricochets cracks around you can feel a bit like a chance not worth taking. This also makes every moment you reveal yourself require a bit more calculation and timing, as you'll need to give yourself time to study your weapon. It's even necessary for smaller distances, as target acquisition, especially with automatics, can become difficult if you don't understand the concept of fire discipline. However, it's in this tiny bit of precision you can achieve by doing simple things like hugging the side of a doorframe or window that can begin to turn the tide of any firefight. And it's in this way that Darkest Hour's gunplay differentiates itself by giving a contrasting advantage to using the environment over running towards the enemy team and hastily trying to acquire a target.
Nice.
You actually need to adhere by real-life shooting forms if you expect to hit anything. Your screen jumps when you fire and won't recenter on its own without your input. This means spacing your shots, controlling your burst, taking time to get back on target, and again, using surfaces for stabilization to reduce kickback is all essential to marksmanship with all weapon classes. And yeah, I know that those mechanics don't seem very unique at first glance, but it's this extreme expectation of weapon control DH requires that makes the silence in firefights just as intense as when they're at their loudest. Positioning of not only your character, but how you angle and steady your weapon leading up to an engagement plays more of a role in determining the winner of a firefight than anything else. What I find to be interesting about this dynamic is that it's not nearly as present in games like Postscriptum or Hell Let's Loose. Not that those games fail at making weapon control important to the core of their experiences, but how the difficulty of their weapon handling is hardly dependent on the environment, unlike in Darkest Hour, which I find to be unfortunate because its implementation does a lot to shake up the simplicity of the whoever shoots first wins sensation that shooters in the same genre have ceiling-high learning curves for.
What just happened?
A gimmick unique to Darkest Hour seems to be only present to add another distressful dynamic to the combat, and that is that at any time, your weapon can be shot out of your hand, leaving you utterly defenseless. When this happens, you can do little but run or hide. No bonsai charges or halo assassinations or even the ability to use your fist. You're bare naked without something that shoots or stabs. And although this probably sounds aggravating as hell, it has made for some of the more interesting gameplay diversions I've experienced in an online battlefield. Whether it be for scavenging another weapon amongst a war zone or awaiting my fate as I become aware of how doomed I am, pulses are always high when you suddenly lose the means to defend yourself in environments as hostile as Darkest Hours. And due to how rarely this actually happens, generally by someone missing your torso and hitting you in the arm instead, it feels more like a second chance at survival than an annoying feature enemies can take advantage of, as when it happens, you've literally just dodged a fatal bullet. I love this feature for an accumulation of reasons, the foremost being that its inclusion isn't just for the sake of adding a layer to the balance, but rather for inviting more chaos for people on the receiving end, causing them to focus away from the ongoing onslaught in front of them for what can sometimes feel like a cinematic side quest akin to scenes from Enemy at the Gates. Walking around the battlefields of World War II and Darkest Hour without a weapon is an interesting experience. If your character's insanely low time to kill isn't a reminder enough of how unconditioned us humans are for making war, you'll get the impression when you're voided of the tools to fight it with. It takes you out of the reality of most shooters, where your avatar acts essentially as a mobile turret that your weapon only separates from if you're exchanging one for another. Because of this feature, I feel like you become more subconsciously aware about the only thing allowing you to make an impact on the disorder around you, being that thing that appears in your hand when you spawn in. Without them, you get the feeling really fast that you don't belong here, kind of giving you an instant perspective of how defenseless civilians caught in the crossfire are. Whether it's an M1 Garand or a Luger or an MP40, your weapons require a form of marriage, even requiring you to run into certain death for them. At least, that's how I've come to interpret it. I realize despair might be a dramatic word to use when describing a game that could just be viewed as an alternative to Battlefield, but I view it as important to understand the elements that make Darkest Hour so distinct in order to see the significance of the elements it shares with most modern shooters. When I began this video, I wanted to derive what anti-war sentiments I could garner from games that ironically put you in the shoes of a participant. The Phantom Pain, Spec Ops: The Line, and even Modern Warfare were all titles I intended to analyze. But I came to realize that although their style, themes, and mechanics pose for interesting interpretations, some of which others have already gone to great lengths to describe, they did not give the same education that involving yourself in a theater of war occupied by actual humans does, where things are unstaged, chaotic, and plainly unfair at times. Of the sorts, I knew I could dissect many things. For Arma, it was the realization that no battle happens in a vacuum. In Squad, it was the understanding of how one unit of a larger team can't shoulder all the burden. For Rising Storm 2, it was how asymmetrical warfare can result in a smaller force being strenuously hard to defeat. But in the amount of time I've given Darkest Hour compared to some of those games, which in some cases has been a small fraction, I've been able to derive a whole lot more about how uncertain the contest of man versus man actually is amongst the fog of war. And by extension, how parallels between Darkest Hour, my historical knowledge, and some of my favorite contemporary shooters have given me a greater perspective to certain realities of war. Regardless of how balanced and handicapped a competitive shooter may be, there's always going to be methods of winning that seem cheap and embarrassing for the defeated. No matter how skillful someone is, they will frequently get killed in some sort of ridiculous way, often failing to resemble anything close to a useful sacrifice or life well spent. It's a reality that everyone experiences in dense shooters, where anyone playing can demonstrate accuracy and firepower. To me personally, Darkest Hour is significant in this regard, because it gives this dichotomy of player skill and what feels like unlucky circumstance on the receiver's end an uncanny resemblance to reality. At least that has been exposed to me in other forms of media and text. Your unlucky deaths, no matter how frequent, are product of the chaotic environment designed to ensure everyone has a chance to succeed, even if the rules and weapons can turn things into a one-sided affair. This realization has led to a surreal way of interpreting the unforgiving aspects of not only Darkest Hour's desperate encounters, but other games where I've been chewed up and spat out repeatedly. I've come to notice that many similarities of what feel like cheap deaths between Darkest Hour and just about any shooter with a quick time to kill actually resembles a lot of truths about the unpredictable nature of warfare and just how robbing it can be. it's become something that is now always in the back of my mind when I find myself on the receiving end of spawn killings, MG funnels, friendly fire, and random ordnance coming out of seemingly nowhere. It's always surprising to me to see how little potential a player's life can have among an arena of equal adversaries. Regardless of how fictitious or arcadey the game is, it always brings me back to the days I had with Darkest Hour, where despite it having similar parameters as a modern EA shooter with a rush mode, the same silly and embarrassing blunders were made out to be horrifying depictions of the cost of conventional warfare. It's a strong testament to how a mod of a 16-year-old game running on the Unreal 2 engine can melt the facade of being a video game away and immerse you into the lessons of its gameplay. Lessons that I find replicated all throughout my gaming space today. The foremost being that even in a virtual reality with all the agency you're typically afforded, and where both sides are given equal opportunity to succeed, you never have the luxury of being able to control the circumstances. It's made me humble of the doom that exists in situations where there is no good decision left to be made, like how there is no decent place to stand in a massacre. They may just be hectic instances of base losing streaks in PlanetSide 2 or spawn kills on Operation Metro I'm referring to, but it's all wound up resonating with the time I spent grappling with how to survive in Darkest Hour. Sure, it may be a very philosophical way of interpreting a video game's difficulty, but learning how to navigate the chaos of Darkest Hour has calmed me to those uncontrollable occurrences that are not only frequent in just other team-based shooters, but just about anything else that I could deem a contest. Regardless of how desperate the situations are illustrated, or how accommodating they can be within the confines of their rule sets, after Darkest Hour, I always manage to find the echoes of those important lessons. It's difficult to think of games that make us fearful of violence without ingraining consequences from our actions or giving it a spectacle to fit the mood of a setting or story. Darkest Hour may lean more to catching a spectacle than the former, but with the vast experiences of many multiplayer shooters that I've played before and after, that spectacle has made for a disturbing comprehension of the reality of what I had been so engrossed in. I realize it's a very ambiguous interpretation, something relative to my own experiences, but I can't help but find Darkest Hour significant in how its brutal telling of its subject matter suits the framework of a dense team-based shooter, both in ways that feel rewarding to experience and disturbing to see simulated, especially since it's that framework that usually is responsible for distorting the realities of its subject matter. When I ask someone why they still play Darkest Hour despite its age and there being numerous improvements in the sequels, I get it narrowed down to a clunky quality, an inertia so to speak, that doesn't allow for tight operations of weapons, smooth movement, or instant melee kills, but gives time for uncertainty to set in between the critical inputs. I believe that quality is what characterizes the violence the most, and makes every preceding input feel all the more relatable. It's engaging and it builds tension in the most infuriating of ways. It heightens your situational awareness and engrosses you into the danger present. So when that suspense does get paid off in the form of a death or kill, it manages to feel far more humanized. This constant desperation that comes from the tension felt in the open-ended combat aligns itself appropriately with the history Darkest Hour is based in, and it's even more distinguished by intuitive human players being the only form of opposition. They provide the blindsiding in all the incidents of friendly fire, slaughters from MG42s, and dismemberment from explosions, and uncomfortable context that demonstrates how easy it is to wander into one of these terrible situations. And it's never stopped being fascinating to me how it recharacterizes the exact same frustrations you typically endure in other team-based shooters. Due to the summarization, do I deem Darkest Hour as not only being the quintessential World War II shooter, but World War II game. Only in the framework of a multiplayer shooter where you repeatedly spawn back in such a short amount of time, can you feel the implications associated with a continuous loss of life and the terrible circumstances that are constantly perpetuating it. And to me, that is far more effective than the spectacle that comes in the form of immersive sound design, immaculate historical accuracy, or anti-war quotes displayed onto death screens. There is just so much more to derive from constantly playing as an ill-fated, unnamed soldier who, despite maybe overcoming a few dangers, will very likely wound up dead. Whether the odds of survival are as true to life as they are depicted in Darkest Hour, under this lens, I believe anyone can get a more realized comprehension of the difficulties faced from the cathartic loss of life in frontline combat. It'd be enough to make you at least reevaluate what you use to form preconceived notions about the realities of war. Seeing brutality acted out is one thing, but partaking in an endless contest of man versus man, where the ever-ranging ingenuity of human players stage a cycle of confusing and meaningless deaths, is as uncanny as it can be sobering.